Welcome to Aspen Leading Edges podcast. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law, and today I have three professors with us. Gerald Korngold, he is a faculty member at New York Law School, a position that followed his work being Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law for 9 years. Nadav Shoked, who is at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law, and Hannah Wiseman from Penn State Law, where she is a professor of law as well as professor and Wilson Faculty Fellow in the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences and Institutes of Energy and the Environment co-funded faculty member. So welcome. It's very good to have you all on the podcast. And I know that one thing that has brought you together is your interest in and activity in property law. So all of you are authors on the Cases and Text on Property 8th edition that was just printed. So if you're looking for a property book, you should consider this one. And Jerry, I wonder if you could tell us the history of this particular case book, which is obviously at the 8th edition, not new to the market.
Sure, and thank you for having us on today. The casebook was originally authored by James Kasner and Barton Leach. It was the Harvard text really coming together in the early 50s, and it was a big, thick, comprehensive book that covered everything in property when property was a 2-semester course, 3 and 3. Beginning in the 80s, Susan French, now emerita at UCLA Law School, took over leadership and authorship of the book. And she asked me in, and under her leadership, there was a comprehensive reform to the book to start slimming it down, to really shift it from a heavy historical focus to a more modern property focus. Susan came to the project as a reporter for the Restatement Third of Servitudes and really brought a modern view and voice to it, while at the same time cherishing the history where it supports current understanding. And then Susan, having become emerita a number of years ago, is stepping off the book after this edition, and we were fortunate to recruit two superb new authors in Hannah and Nadav, so we're happy to have them along. So it is a book with a lot of historical roots, and we still see some of that, the appreciation for that when relevant, but it's fully modernized and resized and now more accessible, we believe, with this edition than ever before to faculty and students.
What prompted you to get involved when Susan French was one of the authors? What excited you about this particular book?
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. I had known Susan. I had known her as a person of great intelligence, great command of the substantive law, and I had also seen her in ALI annual meetings presiding over a room full of would-be property experts and with great intelligence and grace and great sense. I thought that's a person I'd love to work with. I also was a student. When I was a student, I used Kasner and Leach. Not only in the first year property course, there was a spin-off course of landlord and tenant. So it was near and dear to me, and that was a great opportunity with the book and the substance and Susan's particular spin, which still remains with the book.
Outstanding. So, Nadav, tell us what you bring to the book. What's the perspective that you have brought to this 8th edition, and what prompted you to join?
So I've been teaching property now for, God help me, 12 years. And 12 years in and 12 iterations, actually it's kind of 13, but let's leave that aside. Iterations in, you have certain ideas of how the class should look. You learn from the students, you learn from talking to other people who are teaching the class. So I thought it could be a good time to actually join in a casebook and see what I can contribute. And I think that this casebook specifically, and so you asked Jerry about Susan's role, so my, and I think most people's exposure to an important contribution has been in the context of servitudes. And that is context that's really important, not just theoretically, even though I think it's very interesting theoretically for us as professors, but also it's really important in the way property now really works in the real world for our students, no matter where they work in that context. And I think it was very important to be in a casebook that has a strong emphasis on that element of the law rather than on other elements of the law that might at a given time or place be slightly sexier or easier to deal with. And that's why casebooks focus on them. Whereas here, there is this focus on this very important field. And of course, you can edit in and out of it, so you don't have to do the whole thing or just do the whole class about servitudes. But that's why I thought that this casebook specifically overlaps with a lot of my interests and the things that I think are currently important in the field.
And how about you, Hannah? What prompted you to join, and what lens do you bring to the casebook?
I wanted to join this textbook because, similar to Nadav, I view Susan and Jerry as giants in the field who have led important aspects of property law through law review articles and, of course, Susan's work on the restatement and through this textbook. And in addition to the servitudes noted by Nadav, I think the deep chapters on landlord tenant and real estate transfers, related transactional aspects of property, are equally important and very much of interest to students and relevant in today's world of practice. But the other aspect of the textbook that attracted me to it is the combination of practical, modern issues that students should be learning with theory. There's still theory in there. And I think it's a relatively short book if you look at the options out there, but it packs in a lot, and that's what I try to do in my classes, not always successfully. I've been teaching property since about 2010 at the University of Tulsa College of Law, and property can be exciting to students, and they come in dreading it in some cases, but I think it can be exciting in large part because of that theory that animates so many of the cases and that impacts real world outcomes. So I like that combination of the practical skills and the theory in the book. And then just quickly, I'm excited about property because my work has long focused on the intersection of various human values with properties, whether that's historic preservation or the use of land for energy development. And I think this book and property scholarship in general just show how complex that endeavor is, figuring out how we can achieve these values through this system, the real and personal property that are at the core of so many of these values.
I would just add a bit about my perspective in terms of the book. I have what are sometimes competing tendencies to look at two things. One is transactional issues, and to think about the topics that we cover and the materials do reflect this transactional approach. Nadav just alluded to that in the servitudes section, Hannah to the energy exploration and allocation of rights, but transactional rather than simply focusing on pathological transactions of the past and litigating them. We do all of that standard. What's the rule? What was the court's reasoning? Is the court reasoning sound? So we look at that, but we also get to, I think, an important practice, but also philosophical question. And that is, how would you have changed things at the beginning of the transaction, in the servitude documents, in the energy exploration agreement, to have avoided the issue that's being contested here? I think lawyers today have to provide those kinds of answers to justify the fees that they charge, to really act as a partner, if you will, for the client to achieve their goal. So we have that sort of transactional view. The other thing that sort of fascinates me and that I write on as well is the whole issue of law reform. Here's a problem, here's data indicating the problem and possible solutions. How should and can the law change to address this issue? So there is a lot of theory in the book covered by my wonderful colleagues. I'm sort of thinking just by my nature, okay, this is a bad world. What's the better world and how do we get there?
I imagine that today's students really enjoy having that sort of brainstorming opportunity and then coming up with possible reforms. How might the 8th edition be different for someone who might have been using an older edition? What would they find in the edition that would be value add?
I might send this to Nadav in a minute because I think Nadav did much of the rethinking and adding of recent cases in areas that are very important to students and all of us right now. I'll just quickly start with the energy part. We did add a bit more, as noted by Jerry, on issues surrounding the use of property for more traditional energy sources, fossil fuels, as well as to address the looming crisis of climate change. So issues such as injecting carbon dioxide into pore space underground. And I'll turn this to Nadav in a minute to talk more about how we had a central focus on more comprehensively addressing issues of inequality and inequity that increasingly pervade property law.
I can take over now. So starting where we're kind of ended. So what was added on in general and specifically with those issues of current equity concerns. So there was always, and I'm sure that Jerry can talk more about that. There was also always a lot of focus on that in landlord tenant law, and that's obviously still there. Aside of that, we beefed up the whole discussion of family property and the relationships between married and unmarried spouses, which are obviously also historically important and still today focus for thinking about issues of gender equality or sadly gender inequality. And I also think that based on when I teach these topics to students, there are stuff that's interesting to them both on a theory level and also on the practical level because it touches on everyone's lives by definition. And then it does engage those broader questions about the evolution of gender equality, of sexual orientation equality. We added a lot there. We also expanded a bit the issues of discrimination also into issues of public accommodation laws. Partially, again, here also it's the theory and the practicality element of it. So the theory element of it is, of course, it's a major way of thinking about what can you do and can't do as an owner. So this whole idea of owner as freedom as compared to, well, you do have some duties and the role of government in imposing those duties. But it's also something that students encounter also on a rather regular basis. They all go to restaurants, they all go to parties and stuff like that. So it's something that, and we also try to use their examples that are like more recent rather than necessarily just the old staples, just might not necessarily apply the way that, technology and stuff like that has evolved. So that's another thing we've added. Other things that we've added that are just always have been important, maybe becoming more relevant today. So I live in Chicago. We have endless litigation here with the public trust doctrine. So there's more public trust doctrine there. And also, everyone likes beaches. Everyone who goes to law school aspires at some point to buy a beach house. So it should be relevant.
Yes.
It should be relevant for everyone. So we added that. I think that it's also important to note what Jerry implied at the beginning, that I think what's kind of inevitable whenever you do a new edition of anything is there's also editing. I mean, I think we all thought originally it's important not just to add, but also to subtract. Otherwise, you end up with these endless casebooks at the length of Proust's and not even just one volume. And also then the voice gets lost because it just adds something coming from here, something coming from there. So we tried to cut things in a way that all three of us in one way or another thought would make sense for the way we teach a specific topic or chapter. So sometimes it's not even just cutting, it's moving things around and reorganizing them. Say like the big chapters that I mentioned before dealing with servitudes. So I think that was also a point of focus, but of course Jerry can correct me if I'm wrong on that one.
I can just add to those great comments. One thing that has fascinated me is humans' ability to forecast many things, but also humans' inability to forecast events, occurrences, and how to deal with them. As a result, we added in the landlord-tenant section a case dealing with the obligation of a tenant to pay rent it's a restaurant tenant to pay rent to the landlord when COVID hits and there's sort of a partial governmental shutdown of public spaces like a restaurant. It's an interesting sort of mashup of classic law and the whole importation of contract into landlord-tenant law, the law of impossibility, the law of force majeure, but just illustrating the impossibility, no matter how good the clause is, to actually capture it all. Can we build general principles in our understanding between parties so that they can handle the truly unexpected? It also illustrates for us that sometimes parties have difficulty in agreeing even if they know what the big change will be. So today going forward, and I discuss with my classes, you have a landlord, you have a tenant. We've all had the experience of COVID-19. Now that we know about it, who is going to bear that risk of either continuing to collect the rent, the landlord, or having to pay the rent without getting possession? So sometimes getting the parties together, getting them to focus on the issue, it comes to a very, very difficult business, but if you will, a life decision about how they should be handled. So there's a lot of possibilities for a class who has experienced COVID really to a great degree to think about that in the future and future changes as we read various forecasts that have different degrees of scientific support for them.
That was a huge issue, I remember, and I was very glad that my son, who was in law school at the time, had a landlord who said, no, I understand, you're gonna go home. But just as many landlords I know had to pay their bills and their mortgages, and so had to enforce the leases. So it's certainly an interesting question to explore. And who knows, is there a right answer? But I guess your students can help come up with a solution. Now, what would each of you say in the work that you do in the property field is the most pressing issue right now that you are working with in your particular specialty in the area of property law?
Well, I'll start. I've been thinking a lot lately about housing and the issue of inadequate housing across the board, not just for those in our society who can least afford housing. It's really across the board. You mentioned you had a son in law school. Where does he find a place when he graduates, even with a sort of nice salary? I think that is a major threat, and sort of the public issues through failure of government programs, failure to address NIMBYism, to the private issues. Nadav's focus on servitudes that serve to limit building. I think that's a big issue to think about. But I have so many. I have a pad by my desk still where in the middle of the night something might occur to me.
I agree with Jerry. It's hard to pick one, but I'll focus on an area I currently write the most in, which is energy and climate. So if we focus for a moment on that aspect of the crisis, in addition to housing availability and the many other crises we're encountering now, if we think about the fires and the heat waves and whatnot that we see, especially in the summer, and how we're going to address this climate problem, it's increasingly apparent that we both need to build a massive amount of new energy infrastructure, which is quite land intensive. That's solar and wind energy. They take up a lot more acreage than many fossil fuel fired resources. So we see NIMBYism in this area as well. But I'm particularly interested in the subsurface and what is happening to that property regime, because the group of scientists who convene internationally and address climate risk and solutions to it suggest that we will need to do much more than just build zero carbon energy infrastructure. We need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere if we want to limit warming to a reasonable number of degrees. That could mean injecting carbon dioxide into the open space in rocks underground, which we're starting to do. Or it could mean there's a new technique called carbon casting, where a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded company developed the method of encapsulating wood and burying it underground. So the carbon just sits there. And there are many other underground technologies likely to emerge to get carbon out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere. And to me, that's a regime that's thoroughly explored in the oil and gas context. But in oil and gas, we were focused on getting stuff out of the ground. Now we're talking about how do we use that open space underground, the tiny pores or just the large spaces where we might bury materials. And there are many questions, both with respect to the common law of property and sort of statutory zoning type issues that remain unaddressed. So to me, that's an interesting, relatively uncharted territory. There are some law review articles out there as early as 2008, but I think there's much more to be explored in that space.
It's very interesting. I was fascinated when I got to Texas and realized that when you buy a piece of land in Texas doesn't mean you own everything, all the riches down below. It really is fascinating. But I hadn't thought of what you're talking about, and that's kind of the next iteration of that subterranean property right issue. Nadav?
Also, first, clearly didn't watch, was it Daniel Day-Lewis and, was it There Will Be Blood? Which, I drank your milkshake. I drank it all up, which I used as an example for that in class. But to your actual question, so I think that, it's tough to deny what Jerry said before, that clearly just you open a newspaper, even today there's a story about something related to that, both in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, completely different stories. It's about housing affordability. And of course, housing affordability at the end of the day is a function of how the law designs housing. A lot of that debate, rightly or wrongly, is focused on to what extent is government regulating too much, or the flip side of that, to what extent is government subsidizing enough. So you see a lot of those. That's the big hot topic in American property today. I mean, obviously you also have, I think this is the real flip side of that. So what are you going to do with all the commercial, it's mostly office real estate mostly in major cities downtowns, which is just currently sitting there mostly empty. So while those mortgages are already coming up, and you're going to see foreclosure in a few years or even more, because some of these leases all of them are long term and they haven't come up yet. So there's also going to generate issues. Some of it is the issues that you guys discussed before, like what do you do with the mortgage? It's when the bank doesn't want to come in. Also issues of converting it into apartments, which seems much nicer in a news story than it is actually realistic to do given the financing involved and sometimes also regulations involved. So there's going to be a lot of debate about that. A lot of it is in fields that I'm also interested in, about the role of cities or local governments in regulating land uses. At the end of the day, there's a reason that all of us like property so much, and that is that property is always relevant, because property law regulates the relationship between us and the people who live around us. And sadly or not, we never going to live alone in the world. So there's always going to be a need to regulate that relationship, whether it's above ground or about the below ground stuff. And I think what we're seeing now, which is a specific problem within that context of like one neighbor doesn't want their views to go away or stuff like that by new housing, but it's a specific iteration of the traditional problem we're always going to have with property of how do you regulate this relationship between different people who are, to an extent, living in close proximity to each other, and some problems just inevitable.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about the priorities in property law currently and the 8th edition of Cases and Text on Property. Congratulations on that just being printed through Aspen Publishing. Before we conclude, I'm going to ask each of you to opine on what you think the future of legal education holds in the coming decade, how you think it might change. Why don't we start with the former dean, Jerry?
Oh, wow. There's so much. I think legal education will remain focused on the core principle of teaching people an analytical thinking and teaching people clear expression. It's whether one looks at a legal case or a legal situation, or whether one gives driving directions. I know not necessary anymore, right, with the various wave and everything, but is it a thoughtful, clear understanding of where we are, where we want to go, and the different steps to take us there? That is at the core what we do. And I know other graduate schools might think that they're doing that. I think that is what legal education has done, and has forced students to approach issues from more than a talk radio approach. I believe, what's your data? What's your support for that? I think that will remain the same. It will be interesting to see about technology changes in AI, not their political beliefs, but how they see their business. I think lawyers are extremely conservative, and I don't know how much they will adopt it. They haven't adopted basic training of juniors, evaluation of juniors in the way that other large advising and consulting firms have done. So I'm not sure how much change there will be in the profession that will be reflected on us. But teaching people to think clearly and to express themselves clearly is at the core of our mission.
Thank you. Nadav?
Well, so clearly there's going to be much more property classes, all property all the time. And assuming not that. So I'm not sure, I like your Gerald, not to say, well, to answer that question more seriously, because I, Dean, I think that what Jerry said toward the end, I think is interesting because at the end of the day, both, to an extent, both academia and the legal profession are by definition conservative, small c. We don't embrace change, and we tend to believe that what we've been doing forever is kind of good. So no need to change it. And I mean, I can only talk for myself. I don't think that the law school experience that my students are getting today is dramatically different from what I got when I was a student. So the question of will it change now dramatically 10 years from now as compared to the fact that it didn't change much over the past 10 years. Then easy to say with Jerry, like, yeah, not going to change a lot. At the end of the day, though, whether we want to admit it or not, we react to what the outside world wants of us, especially that is with respect to where the law students are going to go once they graduate. So whether it's big law firm, whether it's the judges for whom they're clerk, whether it's the government employers, or just smaller firms. And you guys can tell me that I'm wrong because, again, you're the ones who were deans. But my sense has not been that those employers are specifically pressuring law schools to, engage with more technology or stuff like that. And if anything, a lot of the changes that they're asking for. So an extent to go back to, this is where guest property does come in, to go back more into meat and potatoes, to go back to, the law school that they all knew and to an extent loved. So maybe that would be, for good or for bad, I'm not just saying it's a bad thing, maybe that would mean that you're not going to see the kind of dramatic changes that we all always expect at the beginning of a decade and don't find them.
Thank you. Hannah, want to close us out?
Sure. I'm lucky here because I can largely simply agree with Nadav and Jerry and say, I too think that our profession and our field in particular are the small c conservative that both Jerry and Nadav mentioned. I can see this from a bit of an interdisciplinary perspective because, as you noted, I also work with scientists and engineers a bit. Much of the time I don't know what I'm talking about, but I learn a lot from them. And I have learned that we still have the hard copy casebook. We have fewer. This I think we can improve, but we tend to have fewer evaluative exercises throughout our classes. Of course, the ABA is pushing us toward modernity in that sense. But to some degree, we do have a good thing going. The method of engaging students in a simple but relatively deep and thoughtful exercise that is Socratic light, or some method of engaging students in a real-time analysis of an issue, that in and of itself is evaluation, it's thinking on their feet. So to some degree, these very old techniques, we could perhaps label them under these modern techniques that are being encouraged, rightly so, I think. Also, when we look at large language models and other AI adjacent topics, I hate to be that person who says they're just really bad at it right now, because I'm sure they will get much better, but they are really bad at it right now. Large language models do make up a lot of cases. My impression is they're good at making language sound better, improving grammar, and perhaps that can benefit our students. They're not yet good at figuring out the most relevant cases that inform a legal issue. Lastly, I think one change we might see is increasingly solution-oriented education, because I think that's what our students are coming to law school for. They're looking for answers and ways to improve a challenging world.
Very well said, all three of you. Again, thank you for talking about Cases in Text on Property, the 8th edition through Aspen Publishing. Today's guests were Professor Gerald Korngold, Professor Nadav Shoked, and Professor Hannah Wiseman. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you've enjoyed today's conversation, I hope you'll enjoy some additional episodes that you can access through the Aspen Leading Edge podcast website or from your favorite podcast channels. Thank you for listening.